The primary purpose of Uniquely Human, the podcast, is to educate and inform. The views expressed during all episodes are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute educational or medical advice. Listeners should consult with professionals familiar with each individual or family for specific guidance.
Uniquely Human, the podcast, is produced by Elevated Studio. Music is graciously provided by Matt Savage of Savage Records.
Hi, I'm Dr. Barry Prezant, clinical scholar, researcher, and consultant on autism and neurodiversity, and a Brooklyn boy raised in the big city.
And I'm Dave. I'm none of those things, and I grew up on a farm in Illinois. But being on the spectrum myself, I have plenty of personal insight to lend.
And this is Uniquely Human, the podcast, a show that illuminates and celebrates autism and neurodiversity. Today on Uniquely Human, the podcast, we are continuing our series under the umbrella of depathologizing autism, and more specifically, looking at evidence-based practice. So I'm thrilled to have as our guest today, David Kaufer. David, welcome.
Thank you, Barry. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to be here. Big fan of yours for a long time, and just so happy to be here.
And let me just also add that I've been so taken by your writings in Substack, which we're going to talk about. But a little bit more about you first. David Kaufer is a digital marketing strategist, autism advocate, and the host of the Lighter Side of the Spectrum podcast. His work focuses on communication rights, motor-based communication methods, and challenging assumptions about intelligence in non-speaking individuals. He is the father of 20-year-old twins. His son Stone is a non-speaking autistic self-advocate who communicates through spelling, while Ty is a sophomore at the University of Washington studying political science. So you have a very busy household, don't you?
Very busy. Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the reasons that I thought not only it's important for us to speak, but for our listeners to hear you is, in a sense, you've been involved in a couple of paths and journeys. And one is your family's personal journey, and also currently your role as an advocate. So please feel free to share some important aspects of you and your family's personal journey, and then a little bit of how you got into advocacy.
Yeah, so the family journey has been interesting because Stone was diagnosed on the spectrum just before his third birthday. And so we got into the early intervention work right away. We jumped into it with, both feet. My wife and I both, huge proponents of doing whatever we could, like many, many parents. Mm-hmm. Like I said, and his brother Ty, in the meantime, was showing great aptitude. He was one of those precocious toddlers. He was counting to 100. His favorite channel when he was 4 years old, Barry, was the Weather Channel. He could talk about high pressure systems. He had all of the highway systems in the state of Washington memorized, could tell you one of those kinds of kids, right? So we were dealing with, Ty, we're like, oh my God, like this kid's incredible. We don't know how he's so smart, but we want to do what we can to support him and make sure he's challenged and all that. But yet with Stone, he had his communication challenges, right? Mm. And we knew that he was smart. We knew that the intelligence was in there. And we always felt from the beginning, it was just kind of locked in. And so the journey for him has always been, how can we unlock it, right? How can we unlock him? And, we were fortunately finally able to do that 3.5 years ago when we came across, through a friend of mine. It was kind of very fortunate, very random, who reached out to me and told me about J.B. Handley's book, Underestimated, which actually I had, but I hadn't read yet. and just said that she was actually family friends with him and knew that this method had worked for the family and that he was able to communicate. And she's like, I don't know if it's the same with Stone, if it will help you, but I passed it along. And to make a long story short, yeah, absolutely. It was life-changing. We went ahead, started the process, went down to San Diego, spent 3 days down there, had 6 sessions. And after that, like I said, it was life-changing. We were off and running, and things haven't been the same since.
So our listeners are probably aware, and if not, they will be aware now, that there are different approaches for non-speaking individuals to access spelling or typing. If you would, do you want to share the approach that was used with Stone, just by name?
Sure. Yeah, it's spelling to communicate. And yeah, that's a good way to put it, Barry, right? There's kind of, as I describe it, they're kind of like these different flavors, so to speak. They're all based on the same approach when you talk about like RPM, rapid prompting method, which a lot of the non-speakers use. That was kind of the next generation after the first generation, which I'm sure you could speak to probably better than I, with facilitated communication, which provides actually more physical support. And then RPM came along, and Elizabeth Vossler, who's the founder of Spelling to Communicate, was a speech language pathologist and learned RPM. She was a practitioner, and then she kind of added her flavors and her methodology and created S2C. And then there's been another derivative called the spelling methodology, but they're all basically similar in the sense that they really address motor issues, right? And they all take the same approach of saying, we presume competence. We know that the cognitive ability is intact, but the problem is there's no way to communicate that because of the challenges this population has with speaking, and even like, some of the other approaches with maybe apps, AAC apps, that the brain body disconnect is too strong that they're just not able to execute the skills. So they're unable to communicate, and unfortunately are presumed to be intellectually disabled, and choose your label.
And I think that's something we could talk about a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely.
In a few minutes, about the whole issue of presuming competence, and also the fact that neuromotor issues, both for speech and for accessing communication displays, that's been documented in research and has really been de-emphasized by so many of the critics. So sounds like Stone was about 16 or 17.
Yeah, he was 16, exactly. Yeah, he was 16, a couple months away from turning 17, literally, when we finally unlocked him and he was able to communicate.
Yes, yeah. And so what kind of supports does Stone need right now in accessing communication displays through spelling or typing?
So the support that Stone needs, and again, this is kind of common with non-speakers who are using these motor-based platforms, systems, is he needs a communications and regulation partner to sit with him. And a lot of it's really, frankly, for the regulation. But in my case, I'm his primary CRP, and I hold the keyboard for him. And that's literally all I do. And most of the time, one hand's holding the keyboard and the other hand is holding his hand. And that's kind of the grounding and the regulation. Oh, there he is. Happy.
Like, happy.
He's happy.
Happy.
So
that's Stone.
So Stone has some speech, but obviously he communicates in much more complex ways through the spelling and typing.
Exactly. And the speech is actually, it's always been kind of unreliable and, unable to really communicate complex thoughts or needs or things like that. So getting back to your question, he needs someone to hold a letterboard or hold the keyboard for him. But all the pointing, or in his case typing for the most part, is completely independent. And we're working on independent communication. That's absolutely the goal. There are many who have gone through the different levels of progression who do type independently. And I have no doubt we're going to get there. We're working on, I have a stand that I put on the desk and Stone's practicing. It's kind of going through the same process that we had to when he first began spelling in the first place. It's just training the motor and getting his body and all these pieces to work together so that he can actually execute it.
Okay, so as a dad, what were your initial reactions when you hear people claiming that, wait a second, this is not authentic communication, it's just other people kind of speaking for Stone and other non-speakers?
Initially, I was 100% just dumbfounded. Like, I couldn't believe that there was that level of skepticism out there, because for me, experiencing it is one of those things that once you see it, you can't unsee it, right? I mean, there's just no doubt. And especially once I learned how to work with him as a partner, which was early on, which is great. Dawn Marie, who was the practitioner down in San Diego, that was one of the things that she made sure she wants parents to be communicating with their children, which makes sense. But to do that, there are certain things that go into being a communications partner that you wouldn't necessarily think of. I didn't, right? You just think, oh, you just hold a letterboard. But there's actually a lot more that kind of goes into it than you realize. So I was just, of course, very just elated, euphoric, as kind of the word I used the other day when I was talking with another parent. There's this euphoria that you have once you're able to access your child for the first time and hear their thoughts, hear their wishes, everything about them. You get to know your child for the first time. To go from that, and especially to find out that there was an organization that put out a positioning statement that was handed to me by our speech therapist at the time. She was the one, once she heard that we were doing the spelling to communicate, expressed concern and gave me this positioning statement, which I know you're very familiar with, Barry, from ASHA, the Speech and Hearing Association, basically saying that it's harmful, like this really inflammatory language. I'm looking at like, what the hell? How can you be saying this when I'm sitting here having these conversations with my son? I'm not making this up. Like, this isn't a figment of my imagination, as with other parents. Like, this is real. This is happening. So I think, like I said, it was kind of being dumbfounded. But then as it progressed, as we wanted to find support for Stone in the school, right? Like I was like many parents, so excited to share it with his school. Like, oh my God, they don't know about this. This is going to change the world. They're going to love it. They're going to want to bring in letterboards for all the other non-speaking students in his class. And I went in and, told them about it, asked for support, and they said no. They said, no, we're not going to allow letterboards. We're not going to allow him to access age-appropriate education until he completes an assessment. And the primary reason they gave was the ASHA guidance and positioning statement. And that, again, you talked about, that's what really threw me on this path of advocacy.
And just a little sidebar to that. I did have an exchange with Diane Paul, who is in ASHA. I think she's the director of clinical policy. And I'm sorry if that is not the exact title. And she said that, and she was the ex officio member for the committee for that position statement on, initially it was facilitated communication, and then somehow they decided, well, it was any kind of spelling or typing method.
Yeah, they conflated it all, right?
Exactly. And she said the statements were never developed to prohibit the use of these techniques. It was to raise concern about the lack of supportive research. And the second version was, much more vehement about, okay, it was never said they should not be used. And so there's a little bit of a misinterpretation in how it actually has been applied. But anyway, moving ahead,
I'd love to go down that, because I think that could be argued as well. I mean, she may say that, but I think anyone, invite the listeners to read the statement and make your own interpretation.
Yeah. And it also flies in the face of what we discussed in the first part of this 3-part episode, and that is evidence-based
Right.
practice. And
Yeah, right.
what is evidence-based practice? And it also flies in the face of family-centered practice, where we say,
Yes.
okay, a parent may not be an expert on the technical aspects of a labeled condition, but they are an expert on their son or daughter or family member.
100%.
Yeah. And I've said for many years that the worst thing you could do is to say to a parent, your intuitions and knowledge of your child is dead wrong. Totally shatters trust. It's just a terrible path to take. And it's almost clinical malpractice in my opinion. So
Yeah.
moving ahead,
Yeah.
you have addressed a number of issues in your Substack articles, which I really encourage our listeners to read, and we'll put the links up on the page for this
Great.
episode.
Yeah.
But what are some of the issues that you've addressed, whether it's specific to arguments that some of the naysayers have said, or whether it's just a misunderstanding of what is happening with non-speakers?
So one of the areas that I've addressed, because I think it's just so pivotal in this movement, is that, we talked about the ASHA positioning statement, and that schools, including the school that Stone was attending, he was in a public high school, and I'll actually back up and just kind of continue that story real quick, because like I said, I went to the schools asking for letterboards and for support. They denied it. And so we actually hired an attorney who specializes in education law. She didn't have experience in this particular area in terms of working with non-speakers. So she was intrigued, right? So there was education I had to provide. But long story short, we sued the school district for due process for denying him his rights. And they said that he had to go through a standardized assessment. Now, part of this assessment was they also included the message passing test as part of the assessment. And the assessment was given by the school SLP, who had already stated in our IEP meeting that she did not support spelling to communicate because of ASHA's statement. So she was already on the record saying that she didn't support it. They were going through the motions with this quote unquote assessment. Okay, so I want to paint the picture, Barry. So we go in for the assessment, we sit down, and Stone was still on the letterboards at this time, but we sat down and I said, before we begin, Stone, is there anything you'd like to say? And he went and spelled out on his own, no prompting, no coaching. He said, I'm paraphrasing, my last day at school was my last day at school here was the happiest day of my life. This place is toxic. And she just looked at him. She didn't respond. And he said, why am I here? I don't want to be here. And he ended up making a number of other similar spontaneous statements during this assessment, including before and after the message passing test. Now, fast forward to when they gave their report on the assessment. And of course, they focused on the message passing test, which in their mind, they said, well, Stone failed. So they said this shows he, isn't capable of independent communication, right? The typical statement. Well, what they didn't know, what Stone told me, and I have on video him spelling out, he told me he intentionally failed it because he didn't want to go to school there anymore. He's like, why would I pass something? I want to get out of here. And then there were reasons. It was a very bad situation for him for a number of reasons that made a lot more sense later than even at the time. I mean, we knew at the time. I mean, obviously hated it because they were having him count coins, Barry. I mean, he was getting no academic instruction.
Wow. And
Yeah.
that's not so far apart from, a situation I was involved in that you know about,
Hmm.
um, where what went on in school when a young man was denied the opportunity and the ability to use spelling to communicate, the stress that that caused that individual, and that was also validated by outside assessments from psychiatrists, and a pediatrician who knew this young man for many, many years. That it was just, school was a factor that was the debilitating factor in terms of mental health. And so
It's
we've heard these stories so many times from so many parents, and I know you speak to a lot of other parents as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
I think it, like I said, this is, there's a lot of drivers, but right now this is the overwhelming driving force for me is that it's not only that it's, unfair, you could say whatever, but it's illegitimate as you pointed out, Barry, and like this so-called message passing test
Hmm.
isn't even a valid test or assessment. You can't find it. There's no guidebook in terms of how to implement it. How do you say what's passing, what's not passing, or how do you there's so much about it that's wrong on that level. And then you
And
get into even the constitutionality of utilizing something like a message passing test for a student to access education. Like you're talking about, denying basic civil rights, the freedom of speech,
exactly. Yeah.
14th Amendment, right? Due process. There's all of these areas that I think need to be addressed. And this is what I'm, writing about. You had asked about on Substack. This is what I'm uncovering is and talking about. Is it's a BS test to begin with. We shouldn't be using BS tests in schools to decide if a student can access education or
Yeah.
communicate. Again, communication is a fundamental human right. And to
Yes.
use that to prevent that is just diabolical. But then also, like you said, in court cases,
Yep.
like, again, they have legal rights and to have to implement to say, no, they have to pass a message passing test for them to be allowed to testify on their own behalf, even though we can have hours and hours of evidence, video evidence of them typing or spelling on their own, showing clearly that they can communicate, that they have that capability. But you want them to pass this one artificial test where all
Hmm.
support's removed, to your point, Barry. I mean, you couldn't create a better test for failure with this population than the message passing test. It's just
Absolutely.
kind of like the evil genius behind it, I think.
Absolutely. And of course, you and I have had discussions about specific failures of kind of the validity of the test, such as, isn't it interesting that it's only being used to prove that a person is communicating authentically? It's presented as a gold standard of looking at authenticity of communication by the people doing research, by Shane, by Beals, by those folks. Yet, it has never been reviewed in the Mental Measurements Yearbook, which is accepted as the
Yeah.
Bible of all kinds of tests and assessments. We actually have a couple of our tests in there that have been
Oh,
standardized
okay. Yeah.
nationally. Um, and we're talking about the Mental Measurements Yearbook, which goes back to the 1930s, which is updated every 3 years, which has looked at over 7,500
Okay.
assessments of human behavior. And yet this is not included because there are no psychometrics that have ever been done on that, no reliability, no validity data. And the other thing that I find really interesting as a speech and language pathologist is if this is such a gold standard of looking at authenticity of communication, why is it not used in any other speech and language clinic and is not used as a regular assessment in Shane's own clinic for years at Boston
Mm,
Children's? It is specifically designated as you got to prove this is your authentic communication, and we don't care about the validity and the soundness of this assessment.
absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
it's like I said, it's designed to fail. I mean, it's got the purpose of it is to silence these non-speakers, to silence this methodology.
Yep.
They don't use it for AAC based apps, right? Like you don't
Exactly.
Like, you don't see it for anything else other than if you happen to mention that you're using a motor-based platform like spelling to communicate, RPM, anything like that. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, we've got, that's bad. This is bad, very bad. And that gets back to the language that's used in the positioning statement. They don't just like kind of caution against it, right? I mean, they come out hard against it, saying it could be harmful,
Yes.
right? And they talk about, and this is what I think is interesting, Barry. They specifically talk about how it could be used to potentially, in a way to be harmful, for false accusations for sex abuse. Like that's actually in their positioning statement. Now, I want to talk about that because who is most likely to be harmed in a sex abuse case? True or false? Like, I mean, it's the victims, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the ones who are most likely to be victimized?
Mm-hmm.
Non-speakers. They are the most vulnerable population you could think of. And with a disability, right? They have no way to report abuse if and when it happens. Whereas if you're a speaking student, you do have that, right? Anyone else, you have that. And here they are. So they're not only, saying this could be harmful for all these other reasons, but they specifically also call out that it can be used for potentially false sex abuse allegations, which kind of gives cover. Like if you're a sex abuser, unfortunately, they're out there. We know they're out there.
Mm-hmm.
You have the kind of this built-in defense provided by this ASHA statement. Like if and when you could have a non-speaker who uses the communication methodology to report it, there's already doubt planted. There's the seed of doubt planted because of the statement. Say, well, we don't know if it's probably not true because look at this paper.
And of course, that's one of the major arguments that's used by naysayers. Well, look at the damage that's caused. And I think you're pointing out so clearly, well, what about the damage that's caused when a person can communicate their thoughts and observations, but they're not allowed to? What about the mental health issues? What about the issues within the family when parents have seen their family member communicate more successfully through spelling or typing, or at least in a more detailed way through spelling or typing, and literally taking their voices away, where the naysayers say, well, if you're just speaking for them, you're taking their voices away. Let's be real. Let's look at the very, very few cases that have been presented by the naysayers versus the hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of family members who are saying exactly what you just said. My son and my daughter can really communicate to us more effectively than ever before.
Absolutely. And again, there's no other place in our society, in our lives, where you see this, right? Like, oh, they could falsely claim sex abuse. I mean, there have been cases across the board, teachers, preschools, like there's all these things, unfortunately, where bad stuff has happened. But we don't just say, well, we're going to stop certifying preschool teachers because of, we know of these cases that have happened, but they're trying to apply that same kind of standard here, which is wrong. And I want to get back to something you had said, Barry, too, in terms of the lived experience of parents. Okay, not only just seeing and hearing these words and thoughts and the communication with our children, but the other part that you can't fake is we see changes in our children. Stone is a completely different person than he was 3.5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
His confidence is soaring. You heard him earlier talking about happy.
Mm-hmm.
That is Stone now. He goes up to people. And I love it when we go to Costco. He'll go up to people and say, happy. And, try to high five them. And, like half the people kind of look befuddled.
Yes.
Other people smile. He's talked about this. His confidence is off the charts, which is wonderful because he's got a plan. We're getting his high school degree. He's going to go to college. If all of this were so-called fake, like, you can't fake that. Like you wouldn't see these changes that,
Mhm.
and again, other parents talk about this. You wouldn't see these changes in them if they weren't communicating authentically. If they didn't feel like, which is happening, that their voice is finally being heard, their intelligence is being recognized finally.
Mhm.
I can only imagine how liberating that must feel. But that's what you're seeing in the way, they act and present themselves. Again, it's life-changing across the board for them.
Mhm. And on this point, let me just mention that a major turning point for me, because I go back to the years having seen Doug Bicklin, with some people who were looking totally in the other direction and saying, well, how could that be their communication? And I was skeptical, but with an open mind. And my turnaround was almost 10 years ago. I can't believe that. In 2017, when I went down to the University of Virginia and I spent 2 days with 9 members of the tribe of non-speakers who worked with Elizabeth, with EV, and sat down with them and had discussions with them. Now, I want to put right up there for our listeners, I have expertise in analysis of communicative intent. I've published articles about it. I've used
Hmm.
it in research. And I had those little checklists in my mind. Okay, are they engaged in reciprocal interaction, and what is the timing of that? Do they shift gaze to other people when they expect them to communicate now?
Right. Yeah.
Another big issue for me, and gets right on your point, David, is that these mostly older teens, mostly young adults, that when they sat down with a letterboard or with an Alpha Smart, one young woman used an Alpha Smart, a keyboard, they were focused, they were well regulated, they literally were in the zone
Yeah.
in communicating. And when they were not doing that, a few of the guys were jumping around the room, happy, flapping, or taking a break,
Yeah.
laying down.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it hit me, because this is an area I've been studying now for close to 30 years. Communicating in this way is an amazing regulating factor for them. Focused, and sometimes, as you mentioned, another person is also a regulating factor. So we're talking about self-regulation as well as what's called co-regulation or
Yeah.
mutual regulation. But that was a turning point for me, where I said, okay, there's a lot more going on. And I was down there because I was invited to speak to the psychology department, not
Okay.
on non-speakers, on themes from my book, Uniquely Human. And then I was asked when I was coming down, could I meet with some of the non-speakers and their parents? One other thing I'd like to say as well, just a year and a half ago, I attended a conference in Washington for non-speakers. There were more, it was sold out. At the
Oh,
time,
was it Motormorphous?
it was Motomorphosis, yes.
Yeah.
It was sold out, more than 300 people, about 1/3 spellers and typers, 1/3 parents, 1/3 professionals. So we're not even having to hold up some of these unique stories of people who are doing tremendously well, like Hari Srinivasan, who's finishing his doctorate in cognitive neuroscience, or Elizabeth Bonker, who
Yeah.
who was,
Rollins.
the valedictorian at Rollins College. So my point is, we're not even talking about a single case, which is what the naysayers do. We are talking about innumerable families and people who have now experienced at least various degrees of success, not necessarily fluent high-level communication, but certainly much, much more successful than in speaking or communicating in other ways.
Yeah, it's exciting. And like you said, I talk to families all the time, to parents, to see the community grow. The stories, it never gets old when I see like maybe an initial post from a parent who just began the journey and they talk about the tears of joy of
Yes.
finally hearing their child and just, like I said, the euphoria of beginning that journey and just kind of knowing what they're in for. Like you said, different levels of success, but success is still just communication and just having them being heard. I mean, that's ultimately isn't that all what we want, is just to be
Mhm.
heard and understood and respected. I mean,
Absolutely.
and unfortunately, for so long, for most of their lives, that's just something that was missing for this
Yes.
population, like you said. And I think that's, skepticism, going back to, you said you were skeptical. I would say I was skeptical. I guess I was skeptical because again, as a parent, you try everything. You hear all the biomedical approaches. I mean, it's funny again, all the parents have very similar stories. You go through all these things. So by the time you're 16, your child's 16, like with Stone, you're just tired, right? And
Yes.
you just don't know. And like I said, even though we knew that he was smart, after years of hearing teachers talk about literally calling him, intellectually disabled,
Hmm.
it's hard for some of that not to seep in, right? And just say, well, maybe, yeah, maybe he's just not as smart as his brother. And, maybe this is the path he's going to be on is, this work experience, learning to stack boxes and build birdhouses, and which is where he was, which was supposed to be his junior year when we discovered this.
Hmm.
And as I tell people, there's nothing wrong per se with that path for those where that maybe there are certain level of limitations. I think that's a very small population, a percentage of the population personally. But my point being, from a society standpoint, we're hammered with these messages all of our lives.
Hmm.
There's a clear systemic bias that we have for those who can't communicate. And again, when you pair, not only can they not communicate, but because they're motor planning issues, because of this brain body disconnect, it makes it hard for them to execute basic functions. And again, the analogy I'll use is we would ask Stone, "Hey Stone, can you go out to the car and get your backpack?" And he would freeze, or he would just kind of wander around, and we'd be like, "Oh, he doesn't understand." Well, now we know because he's been able to explain it, and I've learned a lot more about apraxia and this brain body disconnect. That initiation is really hard. Like sometimes
Hmm.
they literally, their brain knows, I want to do this. I want to do this. The body doesn't allow them to do it.
Hmm. And we see similar patterns in people who've had strokes. We see
Right.
similar patterns with people with Parkinsonism.
Right. Right.
This is
Yes.
known. This is not unknown information.
This isn't unique, right, to autism.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so, one of the arguments that the naysayers use, which I think, you know, is another important issue that needs to be debunked, is this notion of non-speakers all being the same. So we found these results in our study with these few people. Therefore, the whole universe of non-speaking people are being fully influenced by their partners, and therefore it needs to be prohibited. It makes no sense when we know that even under the label of autism, we're talking about an extremely heterogeneous group. And yes, there are people who are non-speaking who are intellectually disabled, and there are people who are non-speaking who have abilities far beyond what we ever thought, but they could never reveal
Mhm.
those to us.
No, it's like you said, it's ridiculous and it's incredibly insulting. And then when you apply it in the environment of schools, it's also illegal, right?
Yeah,
Because
yes, yeah.
every student has a right to their own individualized education plan or program. Their right to access education from an individualized standpoint. And when you take these blanket statements, blanket assumptions, including
Hmm.
like right, you are denying that right again. And again, you're placing these stereotypes on this whole population that, we wouldn't do that with any other category. Or if and when that does happen, it's called out saying, no, you can't
Yeah.
lump these all together, right? Treat every individual as an individual. What's so hard about that? But we know that particularly with this group of haters, the ones who are the most vocal, they have incentives of their own to call it out. I mean, this is a group I've learned talking to parents that are consistently either called to be quote unquote expert witnesses
Hmm.
to try to debunk it, usually in cases with school districts or in other cases. And that's their primary role is to try to say this isn't valid. and help the defense, in most cases, win their case. And they get paid handsomely for their participation.
Mm-hmm. So, and that is so true when we talk about one of the common questions that I get and my colleagues gets, what's the motivation for these people to not even leave a little bit of daylight open in the door and say, well, maybe this is helpful for even very few people? I mean, you talk about the definition of cult when you get locked into a belief,
Yep.
which it's toxic to them to even try to loosen up that belief a little bit, because the social sciences, by definition, are ever evolving. Ever evolving. Understanding human behavior is ever evolving, but yet they want this to be settled law, which flies in the face of how we progress in the first place.
And they try to present it in their own way as science, but what it is, Barry, you hit on it with this is dogma.
It is.
We're talking about this isn't science. This isn't intellectual exploration at all. This is dogma that they are just hitting time after time after time, whether it's, through their, kind of BS website or whatever they, do. It's the same message. As a matter of fact, one of them was called out when he was hired as an expert witness in a case. His testimony was thrown out because the judge said, you didn't even evaluate the child in this case. She asked him, did you evaluate him? Did you review the video? Have you met this person? Nope. I'm just going based on what I know.
Yeah.
How can that be, to this judge's credit? Nope, that's not allowable. That's not legal.
And it's the same game plan applied over and over again. So when you say it's dogma from individuals who refuse to engage with parents or non-speakers directly. That's right. It's, these are our ideas, and even people with questionable academic credentials
right.
are putting forth dogma. Yet, for example, the National Institutes of Health put out a statement just recently that any research done on autistic or with autistic people have to involve autism researchers or autism consultants on the project. And we know, and this has been substantiated, that one of the leaders, Dr. Howard Shane, when he learned there was going to be an NIH conference and there was going to be a non-speaker presenting, he refused the invitation based on that fact. And so cult means...
What does that tell you? I mean,
cult means you absolutely refuse to acknowledge any potential information that's going to violate your cast in concrete belief system.
I mean, that's like the definition of discrimination, too.
Let's talk about the turnaround.
Right.
The tide is turning. The masks are being taken off of the false facts that are presented.
The curtain's being pulled back.
Yep. Exactly. The curtain's being pulled back. Yes. And we don't see it just based upon the words of a few. We see it based upon the words of hundreds, if not thousands, the experience of hundreds, if not thousands of parents, and of course, the spellers and typers themselves. So what do you see the future as, or at least what do you desire the future to be as we move forward?
I think that the wave is just going to continue, like you said. I mean, it's been amazing to see the changes just in the last couple of years since we've begun the journey. Word of mouth, the parent power is never to be underestimated.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, we are so dependent on each other. We've all been through the same struggles. So word is getting out. People are learning about it. People are beginning to discover it, which is, again, it's going to be, I think, already kind of reaching that point, that tipping point where, again, to deny it, you just kind of look silly, right? Like you're just kind of like, you're going to look like, the equivalent of a Luddite.
And if I could just interject, to deny it is to fly in the face of the science that supports it now.
Yeah. Yeah, because I'm sure you talked about this. I haven't heard that episode yet, but when you talk about evidence-based, it's not just clinical studies, right? It's lived experience that counts as well, right? I mean, it's just that's one of the components. But there still are these legal issues that we have to overcome, that we have to, Ash's positioning statement is a big problem, because again, it's school districts are using it as a shield to deny these accommodations that we had talked about.
Yes. And
And
by the way, if I could also interject, Ash's position statement, of course, was developed by a designated committee to develop the position statement, which included some of the people we've been talking about, who I call the naysayers.
I call them the haters, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And I've spoken in particular to Darlene Hansen, who's a speech language pathologist she goes way back to the facilitated communication years at Syracuse University, when she says it was the Wild West at that time. Everybody was doing whatever they wanted to do, and calling it facilitated communication. But she also said that as an expert in AAC, she and one of her colleagues, we're talking about credentialed speech and language pathologists, volunteered to serve on that committee, and they were denied being invited. They weren't even responded to. So right away, we see the bias developing, where the committee's only going to involve people who already have cast in concrete beliefs, and we're not letting anybody else in the door here.
Yeah, and let's remember again, ASHA is not like a government agency. They have no, I mean, they're a professional trade association. I mean, they don't have any legal standing, but school districts and courts in some cases are letting them dictate law. I mean, kind of what's being practiced. And as I mentioned before, and we'll keep mentioning, denying these individuals their civil rights. I mean, these are constitutional violations. I am adamant about that. And I'm working with my legal team to explore different avenues of not only communicating that, but maybe pursuing other action.
Yes. Well, it's we have to keep moving forward. And I think especially the results of some recent court cases, we are seeing judges who come in knowing nothing about having any expertise with autism or non-speakers saying, this is silly. How can you make these claims about a person you've never even spent time with, about a family that you won't speak with? It makes no sense, both in terms of evidence-based practice and pure clinical ethics. It makes no sense at all.
And education and visibility is obviously key to this, as you know, Barry. I mean, this is why the work that you do is so important. The work that I'm doing, this is why the podcast, talking to people, helping raise awareness is a lot of it too. So that, judges are people too. They're going to read these articles, they're going to see these cases, and it's going to make them think twice on maybe assumptions that they had previously had before. I know I'm seeing this with doctors. I mean, it happens across the board because, again, we're all human and we all have these stereotypes and assumptions that all of a sudden when you see a non-speaker communicating, you're just like, wow, I was wrong.
Yes.
To your point earlier, we were all wrong. We're all wrong to a certain point.
And I also want to mention that some people out who are listeners who are more academically oriented are saying, where's the academic piece of this in terms of trying to open people's eyes to some of the practices that have been put forth to prohibit or limit opportunities for spelling and typing. And let me just point out that under the leadership of Vikram Jaswal, we just published an article in a highly respected research journal called Autism Research, where we documented the need to keep the door open, where we go from the premise that, well, wait a second, with lived experience, with all the qualitative evidence we have, we don't need to prove that there's some people who benefit from this. Let's put that false assumption aside that there aren't any people, and let's move ahead and understand what helps non-speakers the best. What are the practices that allow non-speakers to be most effective in communicating through spelling and typing? And I think that's where we have to begin to take off from, as opposed to, okay, well, we're not going to do anything till we give a message passing test and prove this. So,
And bravo to you and to that team. I think that's a huge. I think this is like one of those milestone moments in this movement. I know I speak for many. There's huge excitement over that and gratitude. That there's that level of acknowledgement on the academic side.
yes.
And again, it was a strong group. That you were a part of that endorsed this approach.
And based upon both lived experience as well as research, which is the accurate definition of evidence-based practice. So,
Yeah.
David, any parting words?
Oh my gosh. I think you've learned I have a lot of words, but no, it's an exciting time. And I consider myself extremely fortunate to be in this position. Never thought I would be. And again, I always talk about 3 years ago, if you would have told me that Stone would be doing everything that he's doing, I never would have believed it. Never, and that, we'd be at this point with so many non-speakers. So it's exciting. And by nature, I'm an optimist. And so I'm going to remain optimistic that we're going to continue to see this growth and not only continue to unlock these individuals, but see, I know they have so much to contribute
Yes.
to this world. And that's something else we didn't talk about. But this is an incredible group of people who we can learn so much from. And like I said, in my own case, I've learned so much. I'm a far better person than I was, like I said, 3 years ago.
And right on that point, let me just add that it's a very, very loving and supportive community. So, a young man, Danny Whitty, who we had on our podcast a few years ago.
Oh, Danny, yeah.
Who has a regular blog, and when he communicates about difficult things in his life on his blog, so many people chime in and to support him and say, "We're with you, Danny. We understand. We're so sorry," or to celebrate positive things going on as well. So,
I just want to add one part because I think that you're right. It's 11, and again, this community, the non-speakers, this is the part I marvel at, Barry. It's not. This is a group that has every right to be bitter and to be the opposite, right? Given what the trauma some of them have experienced. But it just blows me away that they're the opposite. They're loving, they're gracious, they're understanding. They have so many of these traits universally that are just so admirable. Like I said, we can learn from.
David, thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.